everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wisdom Chat. I'm your host, Phil Holdsworth of Aurum Gold, and my wonderful guest today is Sarah Buxton from Walker Foster's Solicitors. Sarah, welcome back to our sort of next episode around the whole area of like divorce, relationships, and today we're going to talk about pre and post-nuptial agreements. So we'll say more about that in a moment. But Sarah, welcome, and just introduce yourself again to our listeners.
Morning, Phil. So I'm Sarah Buxton of Walker Foster Solicitors. I'm a senior solicitor there. There are three of us in the family team, and we are a large practice that covers lots of North Yorkshire market towns. We've got several offices, 7, I think, in total, potentially 8. So we're sort of, focusing on looking after the local people in local towns, really.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And you very much sort of work in the area of family law as well, being a family law firm.
Yes, I've been doing the job coming up for 20 years now.
Yeah, I can definitely say that you've got plenty of experience in this field. So thank you very much for talking to me about these things. Just to sort of open up, Sarah, would you like to just tell our listeners about what are pre and post nuptial agreements? And the reason why I'm asking that is that there will be a lot of people out there who perhaps have not heard of them, or don't know what they are, and don't know, what they're in relation to, and at what point these things are used. So if you just give us a little bit of a sort of potted insight.
So, I mean, the timing of them is crucial, actually. But essentially, if people were to get married and later divorce, they have to look at the Matrimonial Causes Act and have that applied to their circumstances then. And that could be after a 2-year marriage or a 20-year marriage. With a pre or post-nuptial agreement, what you're essentially saying is prenuptial is prior to marriage and post-nuptial's after marriage. But what you're saying is this is how we see our finances breaking down. This is what we've got going into the marriage, and this is what we think should happen should we end. And essentially, provided it meets a certain criteria, it's quite a strict criteria, but provided it meets that criteria, under the Matrimonial Causes Act, the law and the courts in this country have said we will look at those agreements and 9 times out of 10 uphold those agreements, provided they meet the criteria. Certainly for the leading case of Radmacher, she was a very wealthy heiress, and the agreement protected her, and it was upheld. And then subsequently we've seen numerous cases where the court do uphold them and say we're not here to unravel them, we're not here to pick away at them. What was entered into was of sound, fair and reasonable, therefore we want to uphold it. It gives people peace of mind. It helps you to protect any future wealth, I suppose, if family are giving that down through generations. And it helps businessmen when they're trying to protect their businesses. Certainly if it's growing during the marriage, it helps them to ring fence as near as possible their business.
It's an interesting one, and I'm thinking just from my own point of view, when I think about these kind of agreements, because I've always been of that sort of school of thought, whether I'm a bygone age or whatever, I don't know, but that, when you married, it's almost like, it talks about the two becoming one. And I would see that in sort of every area, but I don't know how these originally came about and at what point they started and to become a thing. But you hear a lot about it nowadays, particularly in the media from celebrities. And I sometimes wonder, is there this, it's almost like an expectation that something may well happen, therefore I'm going to protect, my slice of the pie, so to speak. There's almost that sort of a planning that way. Is that what sort of, in its crudest form, what you would say is actually happening? And am I of an old school thinking?
I suppose in its crudest form, that would be fair. I think for some people, it does make them feel that there's no romance. And for others, they will say, I'd feel like my partner didn't trust me if they were asking me to sign this document. And so it fundamentally floors getting married. So they're not easy conversations, I guess, to have going in, but they are important. And I think a lot of people actually do get married without even really discussing their future plans financially or what their expectations are. Maybe not everybody, but lots of people don't actually have that full and frank conversation. Regularly, husbands, when they're going through a divorce, will say, well, after the third child, I've been really encouraging her to go back to work and she just seems really reluctant. And I think there can often be this expectation or a regular occurrence where a wife may not be in full-time work to help accommodate having children. And whilst the wife may think that she's doing the right thing, maybe the husband is frustrated. COVID brought about a change, I suppose, where dads can be more on hand, and some dads and mums sit down and do carve it up between themselves and say, do you know what, we'll each work a 4-day week, and then we've got two days of care covered during the week, and we're only paying for the other 3. So I suppose every family's different. But for those that don't have that conversation, and there's a main breadwinner or someone that's acquiring family wealth, either through a gift or inheritance, it can be a really pivotal conversation to have. And the other point is really, marriage is a contract. You are entering into a contract. So it makes sense, doesn't it, and it's a partnership, and it would make sense for you to sit down and say, what actually are your expectations? And where do you see this going? And I suppose it's come about because divorce is so painful, emotionally painful, but also financially painful for a lot of people. So I think it's helpful if they've had those conversations and agreed them in an order, in an agreement beforehand. It can be really helpful.
Yeah, I suppose when I think what you were saying about the fact that so many couples perhaps don't sit down and consider the future and think of all the sort of the things that potentially could happen. I mean, obviously, nobody knows what tomorrow brings, but I was thinking, perhaps my wife and I were ones. We didn't necessarily sit down and think about the future as such. We were sort of more living in the here and now. But I suppose when you're talking about things like inheritance and things that have been passed down family lines, I suppose it does make sense in many respects that there's some kind of protection there, so it remains in the family. You hear so many sort of stories of things that haven't remained in the family and they've gone elsewhere, and it's been heartbreaking for people. But the other element, which you rightly touched on, is the whole area of trust, and you can't make people trust each other. That's something that you have to earn in a way, and but it's a biggie, isn't it, in relationships?
A real biggie. And so I understand. I mean, I suppose the other reason for the rise is that people have been getting married a second time around, and that's not, I mean, gosh, people could be married 20 years from the age of 20 to 40, and then go again in their 40s. And it would make sense to, they've had the fingers burnt the first time, I suppose, if it's ended in divorce and it's cost a lot of money. and it just sort of depends where you are, I suppose, in your life. I can't imagine, I can't really say that there's any defining age group that benefits the most from them, because, you know, those in their 20s, if they're getting married, their parents are often in the background saying, actually, we're passing down quite an inheritance in due course, get that ring fenced, or your grandparents are. So we need X, Y, and Z. And equally for the husbands and wives later on in life that are going a second or third time around, that they're saying, do you know what, I don't want to go through, and the trust issue is there, isn't it? You know, for them, they're saying, actually, I don't necessarily want to go down that route, and so can we not just have an agreement that sets out from the outset what we both expect to achieve? And I suppose even the third generation would be sort of, you know, in the 60s and 70s, they're getting married a third time or a second time, and their children are saying, actually, we're adults now, we don't want to have to go through, you know, they're not my stepfather, they've not raised me from young, I don't want to have discussions about where your money's going or how it's being spent. So prenup and postnup are the way.
Yeah, I was just thinking, while you're saying what you're saying then, I was thinking of a famous actor. I'm not going to mention their names, even though it was all in the public domain, you know, in the 90s and late 90s, early noughties. But having said that, this person, highly successful in their career as an actor, so earned huge amounts of money. And unfortunately, on one of the sets, they were allegedly to have had an affair. And it basically caused the demise of their marriage of quite a few years. And so it cost them an awful lot in terms of coming out of that, you know, dissolving the marriage and the financial agreement at the end. Only not to do anything in terms of protecting themselves, but to then go off and have another relationship, which then ended, which cost them something like another $7 million. So you imagine it's an American actor, but you're thinking, I mean, they're talking to me like monopoly money. But having said that, you know, after that, this person then had a post-nuptial agreement to protect the wealth that they gained through their career. But it's interesting on that note, isn't it? My wife and I have often talked about this. Yes, I was out working and bringing income in, but then I wouldn't have been able to do that if my wife didn't do what she did in terms of looking after our children when we chose to have a family. And so it was me recognizing the importance of what she was doing as much as the importance of what I was doing, and vice versa. And there's so many nuances, isn't there?
There are, but I think I wouldn't want to have given the impression that just because you enter into a pre or post nup, it means that the less financially strong party comes away with nothing. So part of the requirements are that the deal that you do and the prenup is fair and reasonable. So if there is a weaker party that is, you know, the main carer for the children and stays at home, it doesn't mean that she is coming away with nothing. It means, well, what would be fair? And we say, okay, well, she needs a home, and it wouldn't be a home at, say, 300,000 as at today. It would be retail price indexed. It would have to be reflective of what would be a reasonable property. So you'd often look at, well, where are they today? Where do they see themselves? And is that a reasonable property? And with retail price index, that would be a property that we could secure for her in the future, ideally, you know, depending on whether at that point they've cleared the mortgage or not. But I suppose it's having that conversation frank and upfront, and actually for some receiving party, it can be quite a comfort for them to know, well, it's already agreed, I'll get the house. And you know, this is how I'll stay in it. And we look towards helping them to stay in it. So it's about assessing their standard of living at the time, but also often it's about saying to people, you know, it needs to be written in plain English, because at some point in the future, it would be helpful if you could dust this off every 5 or so years and sit around the kitchen table and make sure it still meets the criteria that you think it needs to meet, and that you're still comfortable with it.
Yeah.
Because if you're ever not, we need to know. And again, you can go back to your lawyers at that point and say, is this still a fair and reasonable deal? We think we need to renegotiate. You know, I've had a bit of a boon on the stocks and shares, or whatever it is that might have increased their wealth. That maybe has to be factored in. And equally, if they've had a bit of a downturn, that has to potentially be factored in. But I think, I suppose it's alongside people also having to talk about death, which people don't like to do, and also preparing wills. So often we would say to somebody, here's your prenup. Now you need to get a will prepared in contemplation of your marriage as well, that hopefully sits and pretty much reflects what's been agreed in this prenup. So I think for a lot of women, I suppose that assuming it's women that are the weaker financial party, as might be often the case, but I suppose it sounds unromantic and like they might be coming off worse. But in actual fact, you have to have had legal advice of the same parity as your husband, and 9 times out of 10 he will have, as your future husband, and he will have paid for that. And they will have negotiated you a good deal. It's not the case that you roll over and say, oh, that'll do, we just want to get married. You often find it's negotiated. And if the other, you know, you would try and encourage parties to try and have as much of that conversation as they can together. And sometimes we get approached beforehand to say, well, what would be fair if this is what we've got in the pot?
Right.
And it's things like, you know, people with more than one property, selling businesses, saying, well, actually, I acquired that prior to meeting her, so can I keep that? Yeah, you can keep that part, but the properties that you've got together, well, they probably need to be shared. And there's no reason why that shouldn't be on 50-50. And somebody might say, well, I'll have both of those properties, and it's like, well, actually, that's you getting the capital rich properties, whereas the other person's left with, you know, a portfolio that may or may not produce as good a feedback or reward. So actually we try and share the risk as much as we do. So it's a different concept for us in some respects as divorce lawyers, because we're looking at fair and reasonable and assessing, well, that's an asset, that's capital, that's a stocks and shares asset, that's a pension. They're all, you know, it's apples and pears, isn't it? None of them are quite the same. But there's a criteria that we have to meet that I'm happy to go over with you. But one of the factors is both of them have to have had separate legal advice and be represented for it to be upheld by the, you know, otherwise you could easily say, well, I wasn't represented, I didn't have any advice, I didn't really know what I was doing. And the other point is, you know, there's got to be no undue influence.
I suppose in both of those, you know, it's important that people are protected as much as possible. But I'm just thinking about the whole process. Say, for example, of a prenuptial agreement. So somebody might be asking the question, well, okay, so how do I go about doing that? What do I need to consider? What's included in it? And how do I start the conversation with my prospective partner? Because that you rightly said earlier on, that could well be quite a challenging conversation for some.
I think generally speaking, when I've been approached, it's been by one party, and they've either had the conversation with their other half, or they're sounding out, you know, what's the likelihood of this and how does it work? And again, I suppose telling them, well, actually, whilst we can protect so much, if it's your second marriage, you can say, well, I've brought to this relationship, I don't know, $500,000. I'd like to know I'm going to leave with that $500,000 in the bank, and what we accrue together afterwards is ours. We can do that. And it's about saying to them whether that would be fair in all the terms and the circumstances. Each party has to be legally represented. There have to have been no undue influence on them. The terms have to be fair. They both have to have disclosed to one another what they have. So that in itself can sometimes be a tricky conversation, because sometimes one party may not know actually the breadth and depth of what the other party has. You know, I've had that happen to quite young couples where parents are in the background and they're saying, we want you to enter into this prenup because we're going to give you your inheritance early. You'll get your trust fund at X, Y, and Z age. And, you know, when you sit your other half down and tell them, actually, yeah, my parents are quite loaded and this is what I've got, the relationship ends, you know.
Yeah.
It wasn't foreseen, but it may not last. And the other point is you have to have entered into the agreement, you know, 28 days before you get married.
Right.
So that somebody, I mean, there is a case law where somebody tried to get them to sign it the night before, and obviously that's undue influence, really. It's unfair. So got to have done it well enough in advance of the wedding and all the pressure that comes from having a big day, to know that it's all done and dusted. I think often we're asked, how do we have these conversations? And in reality, it's about that honesty, sitting somebody down and saying, you know, either my parents are in the background saying I've got to do this, doesn't change how I feel about you, or this is my second time around and I'm just not prepared to go again because I've had my fingers burnt the first time. And it can, I suppose, whilst lots of us are part of resolution and do our level best to be as collaborative and non-confrontational as possible, because it just adds to the animosity, you know, for those going through it, the emotional stress of going through it means that they're potentially scarred and say, no, I'm not prepared. I actually do want a pre or post-nup to make sure that we don't go down that route again.
I can imagine, you know, if somebody's been through circumstances like you rightly said, you know, they've got their fingers burned, it does cause that sort of, oh, what do I do here? Because I mean, you know, even with these agreements, there's still got to be an element of trust in a relationship. And but if there's some sort of doubt at that moment in time, then, and you know, they're considering these things, I you know, I think about what that conversation must be like for some people, where particularly if other people are involved, you're right, so like for example, parents who are stipulating this is what's needed to be in place, and all of a sudden I can imagine how some of those relationships don't go any further because the parents seemingly have got quite a lot of sway in the relationship, or there is some kind of coming to an agreement. Is there a point at any point in time where courts have rejected these agreements?
There will be. There will be. I can't think of any. I think the majority of them that get reported say that, you know, they're upheld. I could look, actually. I'll look for another time when we're having a conversation, because I'm certain there will be times, and the court will go over the reasons why they're departing and whether they think, you know, there's only as part of the criteria, but that wasn't quite met, or whether there's a fundamental change in circumstances. When we have them drafted, you know, I've been there where people have brought them back in, the relationship has ended, and they've said, right, you know, I'm bracing myself, we signed this, but I don't think he's going to comply with it. And you read it and you say, no, his lawyers are going to have to tell him in the circumstances he's got no choice. I've seen that happen. And that, you know, that's when we can all pat ourselves on the back, because we know it worked. And he did on that occasion accept it and follow through with it. You know, so it served its purpose for that person. I suppose they are the types of things people get done or have done and hope they never need to use, and that it just sits collecting dust on the shelf. And that every now and then it gets reviewed. That's the ideal, isn't it? That, you know, you'll never need it, so don't worry. But equally, so I suppose the key for those doing it is to try and focus on, well, hopefully we'll never need this, but the lawyers have taken care of it if we do. You know, somebody's out there got your back and said, this is how we'll protect you.
And like you said
and
earlier,
that's for both parties entering into it.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, it's about fairness as well. So I suppose if a court looks at something and think, well, this is so unfair or unequally balanced, you know, that they might. Do you think they might sort of say uphold it in part, but ask them to reconsider a particular aspect, or bring a judgment on that particular aspect?
Yeah, they will. I suppose it depends how assets have developed or changed during the relationship, or whether there's been fundamental change in circumstances. You know, if somebody has had a tragic accident and they're poorly, or they're needing care of some kind, well, you know, that's going to need a different level of consideration again there. You'd have to look at that.
So in terms of these agreements, and so say a prenup, what would be the typical things that you would see in a prenuptial agreement?
The example I gave earlier, I suppose, where someone getting married for the second time or later in life that's acquired a lot of wealth may say, can we ring fence X amount of mine so that I know that I'm going to keep this come what may, and what we build together is ours. People would look at whether they have children and what level of care and need there would be to fund that into the future. Sometimes you could say, I mean, in uber wealthy cases where there are children, you would say, you'll live to this standard of living until the children reach a particular age, such as 21. And all of that could be negotiable. It could be 18, 21, 25. But at some point, you will then move out of that property, and that will revert back to the estate of the other person, the other partner who is the wealthier. But you'll have X to move on with. And I suppose the encouragement there is it depends on what everybody does for a living. If that person is earning well, then in theory, whilst they're being kept in a particular lifestyle in a particular home, they can then save their money. You know, some people can see it as a real bonus, because in terms of whilst you feel like that person's ring fencing all their wealth for them, don't forget if you're earning, you are then in a position where you think, well, actually, you know, I could go get myself a rental property or two. I could go get a mortgage. I could go and find myself a rental property to rent out. It's about looking at that with people.
So would you say then that, you know, primarily we're talking about sort of fixed and liquid assets when we're talking about pre and post agreements?
Yeah, people cover off the pensions though. It's all the assets that come up within a marriage. It would be all of them. It would be so on matrimonial law, the court looks at your income, assets and liabilities and pensions, and so the prenup would have to do the same. And again, if somebody was to say, actually, I would like my pension to be ring fenced up to this point, that's not unreasonable, is it? You know, I've spent 20 years earning it. I'll go again with a different one. Or, you know, I'm retiring, taking my foot off the pedal. So, you know, for those that get to retire early at 55, it wouldn't be a bad thing to then say, look, everything I've accrued up to date, I would like to maintain. And therefore, will go again together. But it, once they start to mingle those assets, that can be complicated. That then would weaken your positioning on ring fencing, arguably. So
I had a friend
you would have to,
who unfortunately, sadly, went through divorce, and he and his wife, his ex-wife, both had pensions, and he had slightly higher one than his wife, but it still required a dividing up of the pension, and he just seemed. I just remember at the time just thinking to myself, it just seemed a little unfair. Now, obviously, I'm not a party to all the information, so and the courts would be. So the courts would rule, whether it was fair or it was unfair. I'm assuming. And but yeah, I just remember them going through that and apportioning the pensions.
Yeah, pensions are really tough for people. And actually, divorce lawyers, we see it quite clearly, but I think for those that have grafted all those years to acquire that pension, it can be a real stinger, especially because maybe it isn't as commonly known that a pension is definitely, it's often one of the biggest assets that the parties have. But the point there is often the wife is disadvantaged because she's gone to work less because she is the main carer for the children, and so her pension will never quite be to the same standard, potentially, talking very generically there. Equally, I've seen where nurses that have very good pensions have had to share their pensions after so many years, and that's been painful because their husband was poorly and not grafting and not working. So it sometimes it can feel morally not right. But the court's quite clear, and we have to go to pension experts to do those reports. They're not the sort of thing that we can do or undertake as lawyers. Somebody official has to, that understands the pension markets and how pensions are calculated, would look at that for us and say, this is the fair way. But I suppose morally for those that are working, it can be hard.
I think the other thing that it just occurred to me when you were saying what you're saying was where in a relationship breakdown, one party's to blame for the breakdown. So they go off and have an affair or something like this. And yet they seem to come out quite well in the situation. And for the remaining partner, that can seem so unfair. And yet, I suppose in the court, you're not looking at, well, who caused the breakdown? You're looking at just making sure the dissolution of the marriage, for example, is fair.
It's interesting that, isn't it? Because absolutely, within matrimonial law, the court cannot get bogged down into why a relationship ended, because there's always two sides to that story, and some will say it was because of the affair, some will say that was a symptom of an already broken relationship. But within a pre and post nuptial agreement, people can agree what they like. So people could say, and then some do, whether it would be upheld and you would give that advice, but some would say, I'll give you more if you don't cheat on me, you'll get X, but if I find that you've cheated on me, you'll get Y, you'll get a lot less. Now, whether that would be upheld by the court depends on whether the court say, well, to be fair, she knew what she'd entered into, assuming it's the wife to be that is being asked not to have the affair. She knew what you entered into, so actually you're still coming off better than you were at the outset. If you're talking about a multimillionaire that's saying to her, I'll give you slightly less millions on exit if you don't have the affair. I suppose when you get to that level, you can start having whatever criteria you like. To some extent, we just have to keep assessing whether it's fair. And arguably, there is an element that could say, well, that is fair because on the lower end of the deal, she's still coming away. She's still coming away with an all right package. I think part of the pre and post nup situation there is as well, people don't understandably get sick to death of paying for their lawyers, and it can cost a lot of money, and it's something that you don't necessarily have control over. Whilst your lawyers will always communicate with you and keep you updated about the costs involved, if somebody wants to take it on a particular trajectory and take it through the court process, costs can really begin to feel like they're escalating. And at least with a pre and post nup, they're limited. You know, at some point you can sit and say to you could say to somebody, couldn't you, well, by all means you could challenge this, but it will cost you X amount to do so. Therefore, is it really worth it when you know that you're going to come away with A, B, and C? Or do you just want us to go back and ask for a little bit more? If you're now saying that it feels better. So you're narrowing down the issues all the time, and I suppose arguably you're narrowing down that venomous feeling, you know, sitting with somebody who's on the receiving end of having had somebody cheat on them and, you know, really angry, their emotions are running riot and they want to potentially take it all the way and argue. Well, actually, if you sit with them and you say, A, it doesn't matter to the court, and B, you've got an agreement here that says you'll get Y, whilst you're really aggrieved, the upside is, you know, it's limited. You're not, this is it, the deal's done. If we both stand by this agreement, little wriggle room, let's leave it as it is.
I suppose having these agreements,
take out that emotion.
And that's it, having these agreements in place. I suppose not we necessarily want to think this way, but actually it is important that it simplifies the process, and because it's a highly emotive situation, it's, you know, it perhaps lessens the pain that people have to go through because they've got these agreements in place. The other thing I was just thinking, in just sort of wrapping up really, is when you do, you know how people often will Google things, you know, and therefore not necessarily appreciate whether something that's been said to them on the internet is actually correct or not. So, for example, I did a Google around, you know, where pre and post nuptials of, you know, in terms of their legally binding. And so one actually says that in England and Wales, it's not legally binding. However, I think, as we've talked about, it's quite evident that they can be persuasive in a dissolution of marriage and a separating of sort of assets, whatever those assets may be, in a fair way. So it can help a process that can be quite difficult for people going through.
Definitely. And whilst the strict answer is they're not legally binding, you know, the courts do look at them. The case law says the court will look at them. Provided we've met the criteria, then arguably they will be upheld. And they also, as you say, make it easier on the exit, because it's something that people have already touched upon. They'll hopefully have gone back to the same lawyers that they used to draft it. And the key there, the absolute key, is I'd hate for people to think that these are drawn up by bolshy solicitors that are suited and booted and can't wait to sort of, you know, go on the terms of an agreement. That's not it at all. The best way to get these over the line and make sure that there is sensitivity and non-confrontation, and often the ones where I see them work really well are when you literally pick the phone up to the solicitor representing the other party and you say, look, you know, do you want to come round for a coffee till I come to you? Let's talk it over. I'm thinking something along the lines of this. What are you thinking? And you know, when you've got that relationship, and we're encouraged to have those kind of relationships with our with other family law solicitors, that's when they work well, because we can either get everybody in a room and negotiate. What I tend to find is that can be quite fierce. But if they've got a good working relationship with their respective solicitors, so you'd often recommend you know, if you're acting for one party, you would recommend they go to a specific solicitor. That's not to say that we're in cahoots. That's just to say, I know I work well with that person, and we will and I know that that person will suit your wife or your husband to be, and they'll make him, you know, feel reassured or her reassured. And so hopefully we can get it over the line without any confrontation, because, you know, and it never helps to send difficult letters or emails. It's always better if it's over the telephone, because, you know, those are the sorts of things, the emails get banded around, sat around your kitchen table on an evening, whilst you're talking over what colour pattern you're having your bridesmaids in. You're equally then saying, and you're a bloody lawyer. You know, you don't want that at all. That definitely wouldn't work. But if you can have it so that it's sensitive and
it'd be like having a boardroom meeting, wouldn't it? You know, now we come to agenda item number. Having that kind of discussion. I do even now.
And also, I've
yes, go on.
Well, I've also spoken to people, many people that say, "Oh, I just didn't do it because he said he would never go after the business. He knows it's mine and my dad's, or, you know, etc., etc." And the answer there is, well, that's why they won't mind signing the deal. If they're already happy to tell you that they won't do these things, then they won't mind signing.
And then you know that if they then take umbrage at signing, then actually that what you were being told might not actually have been the case. So Sarah,
so they are difficult conversations.
Yes, definitely. And I'm just conscious that time's passed us by, but Sarah, thank you so much. I hope you've managed to sort of get out the things that you think will be useful for people to hear. And I know we're planning to do some more sort of following on. You mentioned right at the beginning things when we were talking, things about sort of wills and powers of attorney and things like this. So, you know, maybe those are some of the subjects that we can cover that stem out of what we've covered so far. But thank you so much, Sarah, for your time on this particular episode. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Phil.
Okay, you take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.